Most people don't struggle with believing in God, they struggle with believing God. They believe he exists, but they don't believe he will do what he said he would do for them. And that's the difference between admiration and activation. Because the moment you believe God, something shifts. Heaven doesn't ask if the situation looks logical. Heaven responds to faith. See, impossibility is not a condition. It's a conclusion people come to when they measure their future with their past. But God never consults your history to determine your destiny. When you believe God, the impossible starts losing its authority. Doors you didn't knock on begin to open. Resources you couldn't see begin to locate you. And what once resisted you starts responding to you. Because belief is not passive, it's powerful. And when faith shows up, impossibility has no choice but to move. Most people think belief is a feeling. They think belief is something you fall into when everything lines up, when the evidence looks good, when the odds are in your favor. But belief doesn't work like that. Belief is not an emotion you wait for, it's a decision you make. Long before the situation changes, long before the math makes sense, long before your circumstances cooperate. Belief begins the moment you decide that what God said carries more weight than what you see. Because feelings come and go, but decisions create direction. You don't decide to believe God because it's easy. You decide to believe God because he's faithful. And that decision often has to be made in the presence of doubt, fear, pressure, and contradiction. See, belief is not proven when everything is going well. Belief is proven when everything around you is telling you it won't work, it can't happen, and you're too late, too small, or too limited. That's where belief earns its power. Not in comfort, but in conflict. If belief were automatic, everyone would be walking in it. But belief requires intentionality. You have to choose what voice you're going to listen to. Are you going to believe the report of your bank account or the report of God's promises? Are you going to believe your past failures or the future God already finished? Because belief always asks a question, whose word is final? And the moment you decide that God's word is final, belief activates, even if nothing around you changes immediately. A lot of people are waiting to feel confident before they believe. But confidence is not the cause of belief. Belief is the cause of confidence. You don't wait to feel strong to trust God. You trust God, and strength shows up later. You don't wait to feel fearless to obey. You obey, and fear loses its grip over time. Belief doesn't eliminate uncertainty instantly. It simply refuses to be controlled by it. Here's the truth. Belief is not agreement with reality. It's alignment with truth. Reality reports what is. Truth declares what God said. And when those two collide, belief decides which one gets authority. The reason belief is a decision is because you can believe God while still feeling nervous. You can believe God while still asking questions. You can believe God while still learning and growing. But you cannot believe God without choosing to trust him above what you understand. And that decision is rarely dramatic. It's often quiet. It's the moment you pray when you don't feel spiritual. It's the moment you obey when no one is clapping. It's the moment you keep going when quitting feels justified. Belief is not proven by how loud you shout. It's proven by how long you stay consistent when nothing seems to be happening. People say, I tried believing, but it didn't work. No, you tried hoping without deciding. Belief stays when hope feels fragile. Belief keeps moving when emotions fluctuate. Belief says, I don't know how, but I know who. And when you know who, the how becomes his responsibility. God never asked you to understand everything. He asked you to trust him. And trust is not passive. Trust moves your feet. Trust adjusts your priorities. Trust changes how you talk, how you plan, how you respond under pressure. That's why belief is a decision. It reshapes behavior over time. If nothing in your life is changing, it's not because God isn't faithful. It's because belief hasn't fully been decided yet. The most dangerous place to live is halfway believing. When you say you trust God, but still let fear make the final call. When you say you believe, but still consult doubt before obedience. Partial belief creates internal conflict, and conflict drains momentum. But when belief becomes becomes settled, when the decision is made, peace replaces pressure. Not because the problem disappears, but because your trust is no longer up for debate. And here's the good news. God doesn't require perfect belief. He honors decided belief. He responds to people who say, I'm choosing to trust you even while I'm growing. Because when belief is decided, heaven has something to work with. Faith doesn't need you to be fearless. It needs you to be faithful. The moment belief becomes a decision, the impossible begins to lose its authority over your life. Most people approach God from a place of need. They pray because they're desperate. They cry out because they're overwhelmed. And there's nothing wrong with that. Need will get your attention fast. But here's the truth. Most people never learn. God does not respond to need the way he responds to faith. Need explains the problem. Faith activates the power. Heaven is not moved by how bad it looks. Heaven is moved by how much you trust God in the middle of it. If need alone were enough, everyone who was struggling would be walking in breakthrough. If desperation were the key, every crisis would end in victory. But we've all seen people with the same need get very different results. One person breaks through, another stays stuck. The difference is not the size of the problem, it's the presence of faith. God is not withholding, he's responding to a principle. Faith is the currency of heaven, and you don't spend currency by talking about how broke you are. You spend it by using what you've been given. A lot of people think faith is convincing God to do something, but faith is not persuasion, it's positioning. Faith doesn't change God's mind. It aligns you with what God already promised. Need says, God, look at what I'm facing. Faith says, God, I trust you no matter what I'm facing. And that shift changes everything. Because when faith shows up, God doesn't have to be begged. He can be trusted. Here's what trips people up. Need is loud, but faith is quiet. Need complains. Faith confesses. Need talks about the size of the obstacle. Faith talks about the size of God. Need asks, why is this happening to me? Faith asks, what is this producing in me? Need focuses on relief. Faith focuses on results. And while God cares about your pain, he's more interested in your growth, because growth produces lasting change. You can tell the difference between need and faith by what comes out of your mouth. When all you talk about is what's wrong, that's need speaking. When you start declaring what God said, even while things look wrong, that's faith showing up. Faith doesn't deny reality, it just refuses to let reality have the final word. Faith acknowledges the storm, but trusts the anchor. God is not impressed by urgency. He's not rushed by panic. He's not manipulated by pressure. He moves when faith creates agreement. Agreement between heaven and earth. Agreement between promise and action. That's why Jesus didn't ask people how bad they needed healing. He asked if they believed. Not because he lacked compassion, but because belief is the access point. Need may bring you to the door, but faith opens it. Some people say, all I have is need. No, you also have faith, even if it's small. Faith is not about quantity, it's about use. You don't need more faith, you need to activate what you already have. Faith grows when it's exercised, not when it's admired. And the fastest way to grow faith is to start acting like God is telling the truth. This is why obedience matters. Faith without action stays theoretical. Faith with action becomes visible. When you step forward while still needing God, you're saying, I trust you enough to move. And movement gets heaven's attention, not movement based on fear, but movement based on trust. That's when provision shows up. That's when direction becomes clear. That's when doors open you didn't even know to knock on. God doesn't ignore your need. He transcends it. He meets needs through faith so that when the breakthrough comes, you don't just get relief, you get revelation. You learn who he is. You learn who you are. And you learn that faith works even when circumstances don't cooperate. The moment you shift from saying, I need God, to I trust God, everything changes. Because faith doesn't just get God involved, it gives him permission to move. And when faith shows up, heaven responds. One of the biggest mistakes people make is treating the word impossible like a sentence instead of a statement. They hear a diagnosis, a rejection, a delay, or a closed door, and they assume the conversation is over. But impossible is not a verdict, it's a report. And reports can be challenged, reports can be revised, reports can be overridden. The only question is which report you're going to believe. See, the natural world is always talking. Circumstances speak, numbers speak, experts speak, experience speaks, and all of them are reporting what they can measure, what they can see, what they can calculate, but none of them have the authority to define what God can do. They are describing a situation, not determining an outcome. The moment you treat a report like a verdict, you surrender your expectation. But the moment you recognize it as information, you keep your faith alive. A doctor's report is information. A bank statement is information. A timeline is information. None of those things are creators. They are observers. They tell you what is, not what must be. And belief begins when you stop letting observers dictate your future. God does not consult statistics before he performs miracles. He doesn't ask permission from probability. He doesn't need consensus from experts. When God speaks, his word outranks every other report. The reason impossible feels so heavy is because people attach emotion to information. They don't just hear the report, they internalize it. They let it shape their identity, their expectations, and their decisions. But belief separates information from authority. Belief says, I hear what you're saying, but I know who has the final word. And that posture keeps you in position for breakthrough. This is why two people can receive the same report and experience completely different outcomes. One person accepts it as final. The other treats it as temporary. One person adjusts their life downward. The other adjusts their faith upward. And the difference is not denial, it's discernment. Discernment knows the difference between facts and truth. Facts describe the current condition. Truth declares the ultimate conclusion. When you believe God, you don't ignore the report. You interpret it differently. You don't panic when the numbers don't add up. You remember who supplies. You don't quit when the timeline stretches. You remember that delay is not denial. The report may say it's over, but belief says God hasn't spoken yet. Here's the danger. The longer you stare at the report, the more power you give it. What you focus on expands in influence. That's why belief requires intentional focus. You can acknowledge the report without rehearsing it. You can address the situation without letting it dominate your thinking. Faith is not blindness, it's prioritization. Some people say, I'm just being realistic. But realism without faith becomes resignation. Faith doesn't reject reality, it refuses to be imprisoned by it. Faith allows you to function in the natural while trusting the supernatural. It lets you do what you can while believing God will do what you can't. God's promises were never designed to compete with reports. They were designed to override them. Every promise is an invitation to see beyond what's visible. And the moment you treat impossible as a report instead of a verdict, you create space for God to move. Because faith doesn't argue with information. It simply submits information to a higher authority. That's why belief often looks unreasonable. It doesn't line up with logic at first. It doesn't make sense on paper. But faith has never been about making sense. It's about making room. Room for God's power. Room for God's timing. Room for God's way. And when God moves, the report changes, the numbers change, the diagnosis changes, the situation changes, not because the report was lying, but because it was never in charge. Authority has always belonged to God. The impossible is not a dead end. It's a doorway for belief. And when you believe God, the report loses its power to decide your future. A lot of people say they believe God, but belief doesn't live in words. It lives in action. Obedience is not a bonus feature of belief. It's the evidence of it. You can say you trust God all day long, but eventually belief shows up in what you do next. Because real belief always moves you. If nothing in your behavior ever changes, it's not because belief is weak. It's because belief hasn't fully taken root yet. Obedience is where belief becomes visible. It's easy to say you believe when obedience costs you nothing. But belief is revealed when obedience requires a decision, a sacrifice, a step into the unknown. That's where faith stops being theoretical and starts being tangible. God doesn't just listen to what you say you believe. He watches what you're willing to act on. Here's why obedience matters so much. Obedience proves trust. You don't obey someone you don't trust. If you truly believe God knows more than you, sees further than you, and loves you more than you love yourself, obedience becomes logical, even when it feels uncomfortable. Obedience says, I may not understand this yet, but I trust the one who does. Most people want the outcome of faith without the process of obedience. They want the blessing, but not the instruction. They want the promise, but not the posture. But belief that never turns into obedience stays stuck at intention. Intention doesn't move heaven, obedience does. Not because God is demanding, but because obedience aligns you with the flow of what He's already doing. Obedience often feels risky, because it requires you to release control. And control is what fear clings to. Fear says, if I don't manage this, it might fall apart. Faith says, if I don't trust God, I'll never see what He can do. Obedience is the bridge between what you believe and what you experience. Until you cross it, belief remains untested. And here's something people misunderstand. Obedience doesn't mean you have all the details. God rarely gives full explanations. He gives instructions. If He explained everything, you wouldn't need faith. Obedience is not about clarity, it's about commitment. You move because you believe, not because you see the whole picture. Sometimes obedience looks small. It's a conversation you don't want to have, a habit you need to change, a step you keep postponing. But small acts of obedience carry big spiritual weight. God doesn't measure obedience by size, He measures it by sincerity. One obedient step can unlock momentum you've been praying for years to experience. Disobedience, on the other hand, doesn't cancel belief, it contradicts it. You can believe in your heart and still delay in your actions. But delayed obedience weakens confidence. It creates internal tension because deep down you know what you're supposed to do. And peace doesn't come from knowing, it comes from doing. Obedience is also where belief grows. Faith strengthens when you see God respond to your steps. Every act of obedience becomes proof that trusting God works. And the more you obey, the easier it becomes to believe at higher levels. Obedience trains your spirit to recognize God's faithfulness. This is why belief without obedience produces frustration. You're believing for change, but resisting the very steps that would produce it. You're praying for movement, but standing still. Obedience doesn't force God to act. It positions you to receive what He's already prepared. And here's the beautiful part. God doesn't require perfect obedience. He responds to willing obedience. Even when you're nervous, even when your faith feels stretched, even when you're still learning, obedience says, I trust you enough to move anyway. And that's all heaven needs to respond. When belief becomes obedience, faith stops being talk and starts becoming testimony, because what you obey reveals what you truly believe. Truly, whether you realize it or not, your words are working for you or against you every single day. You are always releasing something with your mouth. You're either releasing faith or reinforcing limits. And the reason words matter so much is because words are not just sounds, they are signals. They reveal what you believe and they shape what you experience. Long before you see the results in your life, you speak the direction. Most people think faith lives in the heart alone, but faith doesn't stay silent. Faith speaks, not after the breakthrough, but before it. Not when everything looks good, but when everything looks uncertain. What you say consistently is not random, it's evidence. It exposes whether belief is active or passive, because belief that never speaks eventually weakens under pressure. A lot of people pray big prayers, but talk small talk. They ask God for miracles and then spend the rest of the day rehearsing the problem. They say they trust God, but their words say they've already accepted defeat. And here's the issue. Your words don't just describe your situation, they agree with it. and whatever you agree with gains influence. Words are powerful because they create alignment. When your words line up with God's promises, you position yourself for faith to operate. When your words line up with fear, doubt, and limitation, you strengthen resistance. This is why two people can face the same obstacle and experience different outcomes, because one is speaking possibility while the other is speaking permanence. Faith doesn't ignore facts, but it refuses to repeat them as final truth. There's a difference between acknowledging a challenge and declaring it unbeatable. Faith-filled words say, "This is hard, but God is faithful." Fear-filled words say, "This is hard, and I don't see a way out." Both sentences start the same, but they end in very different places. Your mouth is a steering wheel. It may be small, but it determines direction. You don't accidentally speak faith, you choose it. And that choice often has to be made when emotions are loud and confidence feels low. Speaking faith is not pretending, it's prioritizing. It's choosing to elevate God's word above your feelings. Some people say, "I just say what I feel." But feelings are temporary, and if you let them dictate your words, they will eventually dictate your outcomes. Faith speaks from conviction, not convenience. It doesn't wait for confirmation, it creates expectations. This doesn't mean you never express frustration. It means you don't let frustration become your confession. You can vent without surrendering. You can acknowledge the storm without naming it permanent. Faith-filled speech doesn't deny reality, it frames it. And here's something important. What you say repeatedly becomes what you believe deeply. Words shape thought. Thought shapes expectation. Expectation shapes action. That's why careless words are costly. They train your mind to expect less than what God promised. Faith speaks in advance. It declares provision before the check arrives. It declares healing before the symptoms disappear. It declares direction before the path is clear. And when you speak that way, you're not being arrogant, you're being aligned. The enemy of faith is not silence. It's agreement with limitation. Silence can be strategic, but when you speak, your words should serve your belief, not sabotage it. Speak life over your situation. Speak truth over your timeline. Speak promise over your process. God responds to faith, and faith responds through words. Your mouth is not just for prayer, it's for positioning. When your words change, your focus changes. When your focus changes, your decisions change. And when your decisions change, your outcomes follow. So if you want to know what you truly believe, listen to what you say under pressure. That's where belief shows itself. And when your words line up with faith, the impossible starts losing its grip. One thing that surprises people when they finally decide to believe God is how much resistance shows up right after. They expect peace, ease, and instant movement, but often what they get first is pressure, pushback, opposition. And if you don't understand this, you'll think something is wrong. But resistance is not proof you missed God. Many times, resistance is confirmation that you're exactly where you're supposed to be. The moment belief becomes real, it threatens limitation. And limitation doesn't leave quietly. When you start trusting God instead of fear, doubt pushes back. When you start moving forward, obstacles get louder. When you stop agreeing with the past tries to remind you who you used to be. That's not failure, that's friction. And friction usually shows up when movement has started. Opposition is often a response, not a warning. It responds to momentum. You don't face resistance standing still. You face resistance when you're advancing. No one argues with a parked car. Resistance shows up when something is moving with purpose. And belief creates movement, whether you see it immediately or not. A lot of people quit at this stage because they misinterpret resistance. They assume if God were really in this, it wouldn't be this hard. But ease is not the measure of alignment. Obedience is. Growth is. Faithfulness is. Some of the most God-directed decisions you'll ever make will feel uncomfortable at first because comfort and calling rarely start in the same place. Resistance exposes what still needs to be strengthened in you. It reveals where faith must deepen, where trust must mature, where dependence on God must replace dependence on self. If everything worked instantly, belief wouldn't grow. it would stay shallow. Resistance forces roots to go deeper. Think about it. Every breakthrough worth having is guarded by pressure, not to stop you, but to prepare you. Pressure doesn't mean you're losing. Pressure means expansion is happening, and belief doesn't collapse under pressure. It clarifies under it. Here's the key. Don't fight resistance emotionally. Fight it with consistency. Fear wants an emotional response. Doubt wants a reaction. Resistance wants you to abandon what you started. But faith responds by staying steady, doing the next right thing, holding the line, refusing to quit. Some people panic when resistance shows up because they think it's a sign to retreat. But resistance is often a sign to remain faithful, remain obedient, remain focused. You don't need a new word, you need endurance. Belief isn't proven by how excited you are at the beginning. It's proven by how committed you are when it gets uncomfortable. And here's something important. Resistance is temporary, but the results of belief are permanent. The pressure you feel now is not designed to last, it's designed to pass. But what God is producing through your belief will outlive the struggle. Every level of belief comes with a new level of resistance. Not because God is testing you, but because growth demands it. You don't break through ceilings without feeling the pressure of what's above you. And if you're feeling resistance, it's often because you're closer than you think. Don't interpret resistance as rejection. Interpret it as refinement. Something is being strengthened in you that cannot be developed any other way. Faith that has never been challenged has never been proven. And this is where belief becomes unshakable. When you decide, even if it's hard, I'm not turning back. When you say, even if it takes longer than I expected, I still trust God. That decision silences resistance over time, because resistance feeds on hesitation, not conviction. Stay with it. Stay faithful. Stay obedient. Stay believing, because resistance doesn't show up to stop you. It shows up to signal that breakthrough is near.